Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we open a file that the passage of time has failed to close. A university campus is a world of perceived sophitia, a place of growth, community, and new beginnings. The dorm room is its most private inner sanctum. But what happens when that sanctuary is violated by an intruder who leaves behind only a victim and a set of unanswerable questions? Tonight, we examine a case where a student's life ended in their own room, a crime that turned a place of safety into a permanent, locked-door mystery. Case 1. The Boy Who Vanished at Dawn. The University of California, Los Angeles UCLA's a city within a city. A sprawling campus of iconic brick buildings, manicured lawns, and bustling student life. It represents a world of promise, a transitional space between the shelter of childhood and the independence of adulthood. In the final weeks of 1999, as the 20th century drew to a close, this world was filled with the familiar energy of an impending holiday. Students were focused on final exams, the last push before the relief of winter break and the comfort of home. For the freshmen, it was a particularly significant time, the successful completion of their first quarter of college life. Among them was Michael Negretti. At 18 years old, Michael was the embodiment of the promising student. He was bright, handsome, and exceptionally talented, a gifted musician who played the trumpet and steel guitar. He had come to UCLA from the affluent community of Rancho Palos Verdes, the son of a loving and supportive family, Miguel and Mary Negretti. He had adjusted well to college life, making friends, excelling in his studies, and looking forward to a career in computer science or music. He was not a partier, not a risk-taker. He was a steady, responsible young man on the cusp of his future. His world was Dykstra Hall, a towering, 10-story dormitory that housed hundreds of students, a place of shared bathrooms, late-night study sessions, and the constant, reassuring hum of community. The night of December 9th, 1999, was unremarkable. It was the last night before students would begin their exodus for the holidays. Michael, like many others, had finished his last final exam. He spent the evening in his dorm room on the 4th floor, packing his belongings for the trip home the next day. He spoke to his parents on the phone, a routine call filled with the easy conversation of a close family. Later, he settled in for a night of relaxation, doing what countless other students were doing across campus, playing a computer game. He was logged into an online game called Starsage Tribes, a popular first-person shooter. He was playing with a friend who lived on his floor. The two of them competed against other players online, their voices a low murmur in the quiet of the dorm room. This continued into the early hours of the morning. Around 4 a.m. on December 10th, the friend decided to call it a night. He left Michael's room, leaving him still at his computer, engrossed in the game. Sometime shortly after, Michael's roommate returned. He saw Michael sitting at his desk, his back to the door, the glow of the monitor illuminating his silhouette. The roommate, assuming Michael was still gaming or studying, quietly got into his own bed and went to sleep. This was the last time anyone is known to have seen Michael Negretti. At 9 a.m., the roommate woke up. The first thing he noticed was that the door to their room was propped wide open. This was unusual. He looked over at Michael's side of the room. The bed was empty. Michael was gone. At first, there was no alarm. Perhaps he had gone to the bathroom, or to a friend's room, or for an early breakfast. But as the minutes ticked by, a quiet sense of unease began to set in. The roommate started to notice the things that were not gone. Michael's wallet sat on his desk. His keys were there. All of his shoes were still in the room. His jacket was hanging where he had left it. Most chillingly, his computer was still on, the game he had been playing still running on the screen. He had left in the middle of a match. It was as if he had been sitting at his desk one moment and in the next, he had simply evaporated, leaving behind all the essential items a person needs to navigate the outside world. The initial assumption was that there had to be a simple explanation. Friends were called, the dorm was searched, but no one had seen him. The campus police were notified. A missing person report was filed. As the hours stretched into a day, the simple explanations began to fall away, replaced by a growing, sickening dread. The investigation began immediately and intensively. Police searched every room in Dykstra Hall. They scoured the UCLA campus, its vast network of buildings, underground tunnels, and nearby construction sites. They brought in search dogs. The dogs picked up Michael's scent in his room, followed it out of the dormitory, and led their handlers to a bus stop just outside the campus perimeter. And there, the trail went cold. It was a tantalizing and deeply disturbing clue. It suggested that Michael had not wandered off on foot, but had gotten into a vehicle either willingly or by force. Investigators began to reconstruct Michael's life, looking for any sign of trouble, any secret that could explain his disappearance. They found none. His friends, his family, his online gaming partners all described the same person, a happy, stable, and well-adjusted young man with no known enemies and no history of depression or erratic behavior. He was excited to go home for the holidays. His bank accounts remained untouched. His email was devoid of anything suspicious. He had no history of drug use. The portrait of his life was one of utter normalcy, which made his disappearance all the more baffling. The timeline was scrutinized. The critical window was between 4 a.m., when his friend left his room, and 9 a.m., when his roommate woke to find him gone. The last confirmed sighting, by the roommate, was around 4:30 a.m. This 5-hour window became the black hole at the center of the case. What could have happened in the dead of night, in a locked dormitory building filled with sleeping students? A few strange details emerged, but they only deepened the mystery. Some students on the floor reported hearing a brief, muffled cry or a commotion around 4:30 a.m., but it was dismissed at the time as typical dorm noise. Another lead surfaced. An unidentified man had reportedly been seen on the 4th floor of Dykstra Hall around that time, asking for someone who did not live there. But the identity of this man was never established, and the sighting was never definitively confirmed. Was he a lost student, a harmless visitor, or something more sinister? It was another thread that led nowhere. For Miguel and Mary Negretti, the world had stopped turning. They left their home and moved to Los Angeles, taking up a grim residence in a nearby hotel. They became a fixture on the UCLA campus, their faces etched with a grief that would never leave them. They printed thousands of flyers, plastering them on every light post, every bulletin board. They set up a website, an early and desperate use of the internet as a tool for finding the lost. They offered a substantial reward. They spoke to any news outlet that would listen, their pleas for their son's return a heartbreaking refrain. They were no longer just parents. They were detectives, advocates, and living monuments to a hope that refused to die. The theories swirled, each one more unsatisfying than the last. Had he been the victim of a random abduction? It seemed the most plausible explanation, given the scent trail and the items left behind. But it raised its own impossible questions. How could an abductor have gained access to a secure dormitory? How could they have removed a young man without a significant struggle or commotion? And to what end? There was no ransom demand, no communication of any kind. Could it have been an accident? Perhaps, in a state of exhaustion, he had wandered off and fallen into a construction site or met with some other misfortune. But an 18-year-old does not typically wander off in the middle of the night without his shoes. And the sprawling, meticulous searches of the campus had turned up nothing. The idea of a voluntary disappearance was the least plausible of all. A young man planning to start a new life does not leave behind his wallet, his keys, his identification, and all of his money. He does not pack his bags to go home for Christmas. Everything about the scene in the dorm room screamed of an interrupted life, not an abandoned one. Years passed. The flyers faded and were replaced. The initial flood of tips slowed to a trickle and then stopped. The case grew cold, filed away under the designation unsolved. Michael Negretti was declared legally dead in 2006. For the world, his story became a piece of campus folklore, a cautionary tale. For the police, it is a file that remains open, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. But for his family, it is a wound that never heals. The mystery is not an abstract puzzle, it is the constant, gnawing absence of a son. The dorm room at Dykstra Hall is the epicenter of their loss, a place frozen in time. In the space of a few pre-dawn hours, a life full of music and promise was erased. Michael Negretti walked out of his room, or was taken from it, leaving behind only the ghost of his presence on a glowing computer screen. He vanished into the Los Angeles dawn, and the question of where he went and why remains a silent, haunting mystery that has endured for decades. Case 2. The Final Exam's Empty Seat. Middlebury College, nestled in the rolling green hills of Vermont, is the archetypal New England liberal arts institution. It is a place of intellectual rigor, tradition, and profound, scenic beauty. Its stone buildings and pastoral setting create an atmosphere of scholarly retreat, a world set apart from the chaos of modern life. In the winter of 1971, this idyllic campus was covered in a blanket of fresh snow, the landscape hushed and still. Students were in the throes of final exams, their minds focused on the culmination of a semester's work before the promise of the holiday break. It was a time of academic pressure, but also one of communal and predictable routine. Among the students navigating this final week was Lynn Scholes. At 18 years old, Lynn was a freshman from the quiet suburb of Simsbury, Connecticut. She was a bright, poetic young woman, described by those who knew her as gentle, thoughtful, and perhaps a bit shy. She was a talented artist and writer, a student who seemed perfectly suited to the contemplative, intellectual environment of Middlebury. Like many freshmen, she was still finding her footing, navigating the social and academic challenges of her new life. She had friends, she was well-liked, and she was, by all accounts, a typical first-year student. The day of her disappearance was Tuesday, December 10th, 1971. It was a day defined by a single academic obligation. Lynn had a final exam in her English class, the poetic works of T.S. Eliot, scheduled for 1 p.m. In the morning, she followed a normal routine. She took a separate, final exam in a drama class. After the exam, she met with friends. She seemed to be in good spirits, focused on the tasks at hand. Around 12:15 p.m., she left her friends and walked back to her dormitory, Painter Hall. Her plan was to drop off her completed exam materials and pick up the books she would need for her upcoming English final. She told her friends she would meet them later that afternoon. This brief trip back to her dorm room was the last time any of her friends saw her. The details of what happened next are pieced together from a few fleeting sightings and the silent evidence she left behind. At approximately 12:30 p.m., a fellow student saw Lynn standing across the street from a local health food store called All Things Good. She was not in a place she was known to frequent. She appeared to be waiting, though for whom or what is unknown. She was seen eating a dried apricot, a small, mundane detail that has become, over time, a haunting and specific image. A short while later, between 12:45 and 1 p.m., another student reported seeing her walking up a road on the edge of campus, away from the direction of her English exam. This sighting is less certain, a fleeting glimpse of a young woman who looked like Lynn. And then there is nothing. The trail of Lynn Scholl's goes cold. At 1 p.m., in a classroom on the Middlebury campus, the final exam for The Poetic Works of T.S. Eliot began. The professor handed out the blue books. The students began to write. But one seat remained empty. Lynn Scholl's never arrived. Her absence at the exam was the first red flag, but it did not immediately trigger a massive alarm. A student missing a final exam, while unusual for someone as conscientious as Lynn, could have many explanations. Perhaps she was ill. Perhaps she had overslept. It was only when she failed to show up for her planned ride home for the holidays, and when her parents were unable to reach her, that a quiet concern escalated into genuine panic. Campus security was notified. They went to Lynn's single room in Painter Hall. The scene they found was not one of a planned departure, but of a life momentarily paused. On her desk lay her wallet, containing her identification and a small amount of cash. Her keys were there. Her traveler's checks, intended for her trip home, were undisturbed. All of her belongings, including her winter coat, were in the room. The only things missing were Lynn herself, the pen she always used, and her T.S. Eliot textbook. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment, fully intending to return, and had simply vanished into the cold Vermont air. The investigation began, a search that would grow to encompass the campus, the town of Middlebury, and the surrounding woods and farmlands. The Vermont State Police were called in. They searched by air and on foot. They interviewed hundreds of students, faculty, and townspeople. They chased down every lead, every rumor. The timeline was razor-thin. The critical window of her disappearance was less than an hour, between approximately 12:15 p.m. when she left her friends and 1 p.m. when she failed to show up for her exam. In that brief span, a young woman had walked out of her dorm room and into oblivion. The investigation uncovered a few threads, but none that could be woven into a coherent theory. Police learned that Lynn had recently developed a relationship with a man named Robert Durst. Not the Robert Durst of infamous renown, but a different man with the same name, a local artist who ran the All Things Good health food store. This was the store she was seen standing near on the day she disappeared. He told police that she had come by that day to talk about a personal issue, but he was busy and had asked her to come back later. She never did. He was questioned extensively and was eventually cleared of any involvement. His presence in the story, however, adds a layer of strange coincidence and a focal point for the last known moments of her life. Another thread involved a mysterious, charismatic figure known only as Rick. He was a transient who had been staying in the area, sometimes sleeping in the dorms of Middlebury students. Lynn had reportedly become infatuated with him. Some theorized that she had run away to join him. But this theory never held up. A person running away takes their wallet, their money, their coat. They do not leave everything behind. And Lynn, by all accounts, was not the type of person to abandon her responsibilities and her family without a word. The years turned into decades. The case remained open, a ghost haunting the idyllic campus of Middlebury College. Lynn's parents passed away without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Her brother continued the search, a lonely crusade for answers that never came. In 2015, more than 4 decades after Lynn vanished, a new, tantalizing clue emerged. A tip came into the police, suggesting that Lynn's remains might be buried on a piece of property in a nearby town. The property had, at one time, been associated with the All Things Good health food store. The state police, with a renewed sense of hope, conducted a massive excavation of the site. They brought in heavy equipment and forensic anthropologists. For days, they dug, sifting through the Vermont soil, searching for a sign, a bone, anything that could bring closure to a 44-year-old mystery. They found nothing. The Earth kept its secrets. The disappearance of Lynn Scholes is a perfect, locked-room mystery on a grand scale. The dorm room itself is the locked room, a space that contained all the evidence of her life, a life she seemed to have no intention of leaving. The campus is the larger room, a self-contained world where a young woman, in the middle of a busy day, surrounded by hundreds of people, simply ceased to be. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no ransom note. There was no clear motive for foul play, nor any compelling evidence of a voluntary departure. She existed at 12:15 p.m., and by 1 p.m., she did not. Her story is a chilling reminder that even in the safest, most beautiful of places, the world can open up and swallow a person whole, leaving behind only an empty seat at a final exam and a question that echoes unanswered through the decades. What happened to Lynn Scholes? Case 3. A red dress in the stacks. A university library is a unique kind of sanctuary. It is a place of quiet contemplation, a communal space dedicated to the solitary pursuit of knowledge. It is a world of hushed whispers, the soft rustle of turning pages, and the low hum of concentrated thought. At Pennsylvania State University in the autumn of 1969, the Petit Library stood at the heart of the campus, a sprawling, multi-story repository of human knowledge. On the afternoon of November 28th, the day after Thanksgiving, this sanctuary of silence was violated by an act of sudden, shocking violence, leaving behind a murder mystery that would become woven into the very fabric of the university's history. The victim was Betsy Aardsma, a 22-year-old graduate student in English. Betsy was a bright and promising scholar from Holland, Michigan. She was described as vibrant, intelligent, and kind, a young woman with a strong sense of purpose. She was at Penn State on a full scholarship, deeply engaged in her studies and looking forward to a future as a teacher or a writer. She was in a serious relationship with a medical student at Hershey Medical Center, and by all accounts, her life was one of happy, forward momentum. The day after Thanksgiving is typically a quiet one on a college campus. Most students are still at home with their families. But Betsy, dedicated to her work, had returned to campus to do research for a paper. She was dressed in a red turtleneck dress, a detail that would become an iconic, tragic part of her story. Sometime that afternoon, she made her way to the Petit Library. She entered the labyrinthine core stacks, the vast, dimly lit central area of the library that housed millions of books. It was a place of towering shelves, narrow aisles, and profound quiet, a place where a person could easily lose themselves for hours among the books. Between 4:45 and 4:55 p.m., in a narrow aisle deep within the Stacks Row 51, in the section on American history and art, a sanctuary was broken. What happened in that brief, unobserved window of time is known only from its horrific result. Betsy Aardsma was stabbed, once, with a thin, sharp blade that pierced her red dress, entered her left breast, and severed her pulmonary artery. It was a single, swift, and lethally precise blow. The moments that followed were a cascade of confusion. A loud crash was heard, the sound of books being knocked from a shelf. Students and library staff who were nearby rushed to the aisle. They found Betsy Aardsma lying on the hard floor, surrounded by scattered books. She was unconscious, her face pale. At first, no one saw the wound. Her red dress, the color of blood, had perfectly camouflaged the single, fatal injury. The immediate assumption was that she had fainted or had suffered a seizure. An ambulance was called. A medical student who happened to be in the library rushed to her side and attempted to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. As he did so, he noticed the small, dark stain on her dress, but in the chaos, its significance was not immediately understood. Betsy was rushed to the campus health center, where doctors continued to try and revive her. It was only then, when they cut away her dress, that the true, horrifying nature of the emergency was revealed. They found the single, clean stab wound. Betsy Aardsma had not fainted. She had been murdered. The scene at the library was now a crime scene. But crucial time had been lost. In the initial confusion, the area had been contaminated. People had rushed in and out. The medical student had administered CPR. The evidence had been compromised before the investigation had even begun. The state police were called in. They sealed off the library and began a painstaking search. They interviewed the handful of students and staff who were in the stacks at the time. The description of what witnesses heard and saw was tantalizingly vague. Some recalled seeing 1 or 2 young men in the area shortly before the attack, but their descriptions were generic and unhelpful. No one had seen the actual stabbing. No one had heard a scream. The killer had struck with the same silence as the library itself. The investigation focused on finding the murder weapon. The wound suggested a small, sharp knife, perhaps a penknife or a stiletto. A search of the library and the surrounding campus turned up nothing. The killer had walked in with the weapon, used it, and walked out with it, vanishing as if into thin air. The police began the difficult work of building a victimology. Who would want to kill Betsy Aardsma? They found a young woman who was universally loved and respected. She had no known enemies, no secret life, no involvement in anything that would put her at risk. The motive seemed to be non-existent. Was it a random attack? A crime of opportunity committed by a disturbed individual who happened to be in the library that day? This seemed the most likely scenario, but it was also the most terrifying and the most difficult to solve. A few potential persons of interest emerged over the years, their names whispered in connection with the case, but no theory ever solidified into hard evidence. One was a fellow graduate student who had a reputation for being eccentric and who was known to carry knives. He was questioned, but police could never definitively link him to the crime. Another, more compelling suspect emerged decades later through the work of an investigative journalist. The suspect was a geology student who was also in the library that day. He had a history of violence against women and had reportedly confessed the murder to a friend. He was known to be obsessed with geology and had access to knives and rock hammers. The theory was that he had attacked Betsy in a fit of rage after she had rejected him. This suspect, however, had died years earlier, taking his secrets, if he had any, to the grave. While the theory was plausible, it remained just that, a theory built on circumstantial evidence and hearsay, not enough to officially close the case. The murder of Betsy Aardsma left a deep and lasting wound on the Penn State community. It shattered the illusion of the campus as a safe haven. The library, once a symbol of quiet security, became a place associated with a dark and unsolved crime. For years, students would whisper about the ghost of the girl in the red dress, haunting the stacks. The case itself is a study in the terrible geometry of a perfect crime. The location was public, yet intensely private. The timing was precise, a fleeting moment of opportunity. The weapon was small and easily concealed. The victim was chosen, it seems, at random. The killer struck and then simply melted back into the fabric of the university, indistinguishable from any other student walking across the campus green. The image of Betsy Aardsma lying on the floor in her red dress, her fatal wound hidden by the very color of her clothing, is a powerful and tragic metaphor for the case itself. The truth of what happened that day remains hidden in plain sight, obscured by the passage of time, the lack of evidence, and the silence of a killer who is never caught. The Petit Library holds millions of stories on its shelves, But the one story that matters most, the story of who killed Betsy Aardsma and why's the one book that has never been found. It remains an open case, a final, unanswered question in the heart of the library's silence. Case 4. The Halloween Night's Last Walk. Halloween night on a college campus is a unique spectacle. It is a night of sanctioned transgression, a time when the normal rules of student life are suspended in favor of costumes, parties, and a citywide atmosphere of festive chaos. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, on Halloween night of 2002, the campus of the University of Minnesota was alive with this energy. Thousands of students thronged the streets, moving between house parties and bars, their identities concealed behind masks and makeup. It was a night of joyous, anonymous revelry. But for one student, this night of celebration would be his last, and his disappearance into the festive crowd would mark the beginning of a mystery that continues to raise more questions than answers. The student was Chris Jenkins, a 21-year-old junior at the university's Carlson School of Management. Chris was a popular, athletic, and outgoing young man. He was a talented lacrosse player, a member of the Alpha Tau Omega fraternity, and known for his infectious smile and easygoing nature. He was, by all accounts, a young man at the peak of his life, surrounded by friends and with a bright future ahead of him. On the evening of October 31st, 2002, Chris put on his Halloween costume. He was dressed as a Native American chief, complete with a feathered headdress. He and a group of friends made their way to the Lone Tree Bar and Grill in downtown Minneapolis, a popular spot for students. The bar was packed, a chaotic sea of costumed revelers. The group drank, socialized, and celebrated. The timeline of what happened next is fractured, pieced together from the hazy, alcohol-fueled memories of his friends. Around midnight, the festive atmosphere took a turn. Chris was ejected from the bar. The exact reason remains unclear. Some accounts say he was involved in a minor altercation, others that he was simply too intoxicated. Whatever the reason, he was put out onto the street, alone, in the middle of a chaotic Halloween night. His friends, still inside the bar, did not realize he was gone for some time. When they did, they assumed he had simply gone on to another party or had decided to walk home. In the confusion of the night, his absence did not immediately register as an emergency. They tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They figured they would see him the next day. But the next day came, and Chris was nowhere to be found. He didn't show up for his classes. He didn't answer his phone. His friends and family began to worry. A missing person report was filed. The search for Chris Jenkins began. His parents, Jan and Steve Jenkins, drove to Minneapolis and began a desperate, 4-month-long vigil. They, along with hundreds of volunteers, plastered the city with missing person flyers. They organized massive search parties, combing the banks of the nearby Mississippi River. They hired a private investigator. They offered a substantial reward. The case became a fixture in the local news, the smiling face of Chris Jenkins in his lacrosse uniform a constant, heartbreaking presence. The Minneapolis Police Department initially treated the case as a likely accident. Their prevailing theory was straightforward and tragically common. A young, intoxicated man, disoriented and alone, had wandered away from the bar, stumbled towards the Mississippi River just a few blocks away, fallen into the icy water, and drowned. It was a plausible theory supported by numerous similar cases across the country. The river, they believed, would eventually give up its secret. For 4 long, agonizing months, the Jenkins family waited through the brutal Minnesota winter, clinging to the hope that their son was still alive. They refused to accept the police theory, insisting that Chris was not the type to wander off, that something else must have happened. On February 27, 2003, their vigil came to a grim end. Chris Jenkins's body was found in the Mississippi River, snagged on a log near a downtown dam. The discoveries seemed to confirm the police's initial theory. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning. There were no obvious signs of trauma on the body. The case, it seemed, was closed. A tragic accident, a young life cut short. But for the Jenkins family, the discovery of the body did not bring closure. It brought a new set of agonizing questions. There were details that simply did not fit the narrative of an accidental drowning. Chris's Halloween costume, the distinctive feather headdress, was still perfectly placed on his head, something his family argued would be impossible if he had tumbled into a fast-moving river. The level of alcohol in his system, while significant, was not, in their opinion, high enough to render him completely incapacitated. And there was the simple, nagging question of his character. He was a strong swimmer, a capable athlete. Would he have simply fallen? The family's private investigator continued to dig. They focused on Chris's final moments, the hazy timeline around midnight at the Lone Tree Bar. They re-interviewed witnesses. They pushed for a re-examination of the evidence. For years, their pleas for the police to reopen the case were met with resistance. The official story held firm. Then, for years after his death in 2006, the case took a stunning turn. The Minneapolis police chief, Tim Dolan, held a press conference. He announced that they were reclassifying the death of Chris Jenkins. It was no longer considered an accident. It was now officially a homicide. The reason for this dramatic reversal was new information, a tip that had come from an informant who was in prison on unrelated charges. The details of this tip have never been made fully public, but the police stated that it provided credible evidence that Chris Jenkins had been the victim of a random act of violence on Halloween night. The new theory was that after being ejected from the bar, Chris had encountered one or more individuals on a bridge spanning the Mississippi River. An altercation occurred, and Chris was intentionally thrown from the bridge into the river below. This new theory explained many of the inconsistencies that had haunted the Jenkins family. It explained how his headdress could have remained in place. It explained the lack of witnesses to a quick, violent encounter on a crowded, chaotic night. The police now had a new narrative, but they still had no suspects. The informant's tip was not enough to lead to an arrest. The individuals responsible, if they existed, remained anonymous, ghosts from a long-ago Halloween night. The reclassification of the case threw the mystery into a new, even more frustrating light. It confirmed the family's deepest fears that their son had been murdered, but it brought them no closer to justice. The identity of his killer or killers remains unknown. The case of Chris Jenkins is a haunting example of how the unique environment of a college town celebration can both create the opportunity for a crime and provide the perfect cover for its perpetrators. On any other night, a young man's disappearance would have been immediately noticed. But on Halloween, amidst a sea of masked faces and loud celebrations, he was able to vanish without a trace. His death was initially swallowed by a plausible, but incorrect, assumption. The truth, when it finally emerged, was a more sinister story, but one with no final chapter. The questions remain. Who were the individuals Chris encountered on that bridge? What was the nature of the altercation? Was it a robbery gone wrong? A random, senseless act of violence fueled by alcohol and the anonymity of the night? The answers were lost in the noise of the party, and now they are buried under 2 decades of silence. Chris Jenkins walked out of a bar and into a mystery that the city has never been able to solve, his case a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying masks are the ones that are never taken off. Case 5. The Suicide That Cried Murder. In the landscape of unsolved crimes, some of the most perplexing are those that are not initially recognized as crimes at all. They are cases where the official narrative is one of self-inflicted harm, a story of quiet despair that ends in a tragic, but closed, chapter. This is the story of a young man whose death was officially ruled a suicide, but whose final, silent moments were surrounded by a constellation of bizarre and contradictory evidence, evidence that has led his family and many investigators to believe that he was not a victim of his own hand, but of a carefully and cruelly staged murder. The setting is La Crosse, Wisconsin, a picturesque city on the banks of the Mississippi River. In the autumn of 1992, Jonathan Luna, a 23-year-old student at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, was seemingly on a path to success. He was a promising biology major, a young man described by his family as intelligent, ambitious, and full of life. He had plans to attend medical school. He was not known to have any history of depression or mental illness. His life appeared to be one of normal, upward trajectory. On the morning of December 14, 1992, Jonathan's life came to a sudden and violent end. His body was found in his dorm room at Reuter Hall. He was hanging by the neck from a leather belt which was attached to the top bunk of his bed. At first glance, the scene presented a clear and tragic narrative. The door to his room was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. The initial police response was to treat it as a suicide. A young man, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of final exams or a hidden personal struggle, had taken his own life. The case seemed heartbreakingly straightforward. The La Crosse County coroner performed an autopsy. The official cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation by hanging. The manner of death was listed as suicide. For the authorities, the file was effectively closed. Another college tragedy, another life ended too soon. But for Jonathan Luna's family, particularly his father, Dr. Art Luna, a respected pathologist from their home state of North Dakota, the official story was not just heartbreaking, it was impossible. When Dr. Luna received the autopsy report and the details of the scene, he saw not the signs of a suicide, but a series of red flags, a collection of physical and circumstantial evidence that screamed of foul play. He began his own investigation, a father's quest for a truth he believed was being ignored. The first and most glaring inconsistency was the state of Jonathan's body. While the official cause of death was hanging, Jonathan had a series of injuries that were completely inconsistent with a simple suicide. The autopsy report noted minor abrasions and contusions on his body. But most significantly, the hyoid bone in his neck, a small, U-shaped bone that is often broken in cases of manual strangulation but is rarely broken in hangings, especially in young people, is fractured. To Dr. Luna, this was a classic sign of homicide. Then there was the ligature itself. The belt used in the hanging was not Jonathan's. It was a brand and style he did not own. Where had it come from? More disturbingly, the knot used to secure the belt was a complex, specialized type of knot, one that Jonathan, who had no background in sailing or climbing, would have had no reason to know how to tie. The scene in the dorm room also contained a series of bizarre and troubling clues. Jonathan's wallet was found, but the small amount of cash he was known to carry was missing. A half-eaten sandwich and a can of soda were on his desk, suggesting his final moments were not those of a man planning to end his life. And then there was the music. When his body was discovered, his stereo was playing a CD on repeat, the soundtrack to the film The Last of the Mohicans. The specific track that was playing was a somber, funereal piece. Was this a clue left by a killer with a flair for the dramatic, a macabre soundtrack for a staged scene? Dr. Luna's investigation uncovered more. He learned that in the days leading up to his death, Jonathan had made several large cash withdrawals from his bank account, totaling several $100s. This money was never found. He had also spoken to a friend about a problem he was having, mentioning a shady character he had recently met. He seemed nervous, but he did not elaborate. The most compelling evidence of a cover-up, however, came from the crime scene itself. Dr. Luna, using his own expertise, argued that the physical evidence did not support a hanging at all. The ligature marks on Jonathan's neck, he contended, were not consistent with the position in which his body was found. He believed that Jonathan had been manually strangled, likely somewhere else, and that his body was then moved to the dorm room and staged to look like a suicide. The locked door, which seemed to be the linchpin of the suicide theory, could have been manipulated. The type of lock on the dorm room door could have been locked from the outside with a simple tool. Dr. Luna's persistent and vocal campaign for a new investigation eventually gained traction. He hired private investigators. He presented his findings to the media. The case was re-examined by forensic experts who agreed with many of his conclusions. The story of Jonathan Luna's suicide began to look more and more like a carefully orchestrated murder. A new theory of the case began to emerge, one that was far darker and more complex than a simple suicide. The theory was that Jonathan had become entangled in something dangerous, something that led to his death. Had he fallen in with the wrong crowd? Had he been involved in a low-level drug deal that went wrong? The missing money, the shady character he mentioned, the fear he expressed to his friend, it all pointed to a secret life his family knew nothing about. In this scenario, he was killed over a debt or a dispute, and his killer or killers, in an act of cold, calculated cunning, staged his death as a suicide to throw off the police. The killer was not a random intruder. It was someone Jonathan knew, someone he had perhaps let into his room. Despite the compelling evidence and the persistent efforts of his family, the official manner of death has never been changed. The La Crosse Police Department has, at various times, reviewed the case, but it remains officially classified as a suicide. The district attorney's office has stated that without new, definitive evidence such as a confession or a new witness, there is not enough to formally reopen the case as a homicide investigation. The case of Jonathan Luna is a masterclass in ambiguity. It is a story that exists in a gray area between two starkly different narratives. Was he a young man who had a deep and fatal despair from everyone who knew him, a despair that led him to take his own life in a bizarre and atypical manner? Or was he the victim of a clever and ruthless killer, a killer who not only took his life but also stole his truth, framing him for his own death and leaving his family to fight a lonely, decades-long battle for justice? The dorm room at Reuter Hall holds the answer. It is a scene that has been interpreted in two completely different ways, like an optical illusion that shifts depending on where you focus. But for the Luna family, there is no illusion. There is only the certainty that their son was murdered, and that his killer was so successful in their deception that they managed to convince the world to look the other way. The file may be closed, but the mystery remains, a quiet testament to the idea that sometimes the most profound unsolved crimes are the ones that are hidden in plain sight. A university campus is a world in constant motion, a place of transient populations and fleeting moments. When a crime occurs within its walls and goes unsolved, it leaves a unique and persistent scar. The evidence scatters, the witnesses graduate and move on, and the case files gather dust. But the questions remain, echoing in the quiet hallways of a dormitory, the empty seat of a classroom, or the silent stacks of a library. For the families left behind, there is no graduation, no moving on, only a permanent, locked-door mystery that time has failed to solve. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well and stay safe.